Alright, so a quick disclaimer before I start this review slash deep dive. If at any point in the video you'd see me wearing different hats or different shirts, I want you to think of this as part of the experience of the chaos that is about to unfold in 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome back to Gravity's Random. I'm your host Robin. If you're new here, welcome, and if you've returned, great to have you back. Now, it's been some time since my last video, I have to admit, months ago, around 3 months ago, I think, give or take, but for not without good reason. Like, I've been very busy with writing, very busy with life in general, but for now, today, I want to talk about these beauties right here. Specifically, Satantango, the Melancholy of Resistance, War and War, and capstone, Báró Wenckheim's Homecoming, otherwise known as the Apocalypse Quartet, otherwise known as Laszlo Krasznahorkai's magnum opus, the one book that he's been building for decades. But before we get to that point, I want to introduce the apocalypse. But what is an apocalypse? Well, an apocalypse, if one would picture it in traditional terms, might mean something along the lines of revelations, for example, like Earth opening up, earthquakes happening, the oceans splitting apart, fire and brimstone, a plague of locusts, or a plague of scorpion-tailed, what have you. All of those things, like the mark of the beast, whatever, all of those could be traditionally what people might think of an apocalypse. But to Krasznahorkai, an apocalypse is something else entirely. If we take a look at his 4 works, there seems to be a running theme of inertia, isolation, the mundane existence trailing off into nothing, as if nobody is really heading anywhere but to their own oblivion, something like that. That is, to Krasznahorkai, the apocalypse. And rightfully so, as he was called or touted by Susan Sontag in an earlier review as a master of the apocalypse. And in order to understand the apocalypse, I'd want to go back to my earlier experiences overall with his books and films about his work. Now, for the books themselves, they have taken me quite some time to get through. I've spent most of, I believe it was June, oh no, I believe it was May. I spent most of May getting through the Apocalypse Quartet, and every sentence, every rolling, cascading, long sentence of his felt like, again, a slow lava. Like, to use George Szirtes' description of his prose, slow lava flow type. Like, as if all of these sentences that Krasznahorkai is building up to a kind of eternity that refuses to let up, an eternity that again reflects the very apocalypse that he is building toward, the vision of a world gone mad, but in a way that refuses to be known, or refuses to show itself as a world gone completely mad. It's just madness lurking underneath the surface, and that's what I've been experiencing with his books. As for the films now, Satantango, just to give a brief retrospective, Satantango I watched a few years ago when I was in college, because I wanted to see for myself because like I've seen all of these reviews and all of these descriptions about Satantango, the film version by Bellatar, being one of the longest films ever made at 7 hours plus. Like, funny enough, like when I watched Satantango and when I read Satantango in like after the fact, like I counted up all the hours that I read and the hours that I watched the movie, and it's funny because like I had around 1 hour to spare after I've read the book for about 6 hours, like 1 hour to spare, as opposed to the movie, which is like 7 hours. So there's like 1 hour difference between those two pieces of media, which is still funny to me. But it's a unique experience. Like watching Satantango that early on, like just did something to me. Like the long takes that Krasznahorkai's vision complemented, like the long takes complemented the book in every which way, and it really added this depth, like because like the long take is to Bellatar what the sentence is to Krasznahorkai in a sense, and that's what I felt with Satantango. And again, there's another one of his books, the Melancholy of Resistance, that has a movie, and that movie is Werckmeister Harmonies, which is actually part 2 of the Melancholy of Resistance. Now, Werckmeister Harmonies, that in itself is, again, it took a lot of liberties with the book, because like Werckmeister Harmonies, for example, the relationship between Georgi and Baluska is revised in the book Georgi and Baluska are just simply friends. Like Baluska's taking care of Georgi out of obligation, but then in the movie, Georgi became the uncle of Baluska, whereas in the book it's not really that outlined, and it's like it's been condensed into this. Again, because it's just 2 hours long, not as long as Satantango, which is like the whole book. Unlike what the book set out to do, unlike what Melancholy set out to do. And in a way, it's as if, again, it's a futile is the best way for me to describe it. Like there's this futility, underlying futility that happens in the movie that, again, I think not as powerful as the futility shown in the book, but still just as effective. Like Ranitsky and Tar outdid themselves with this one as well. So yeah, that's about it for the film section. And in a way, those two experiences, again, the common theme is the length, and I want to expound upon that length even more by talking about the long sentence. Now, in a video, like many videos ago, I had another video talking about the art of the long sentence, and in one of those examples in the video, I talked about how, again, one of the books mentioned was Sabo There Below, and one hallmark is Krasznahorkai's use of the long sentence. Again, the way he used the long sentence in Sabo is very different, to say the least. It's very different from what he set out to do with the Apocalypse Quartet, because in Sabo, he uses the long sentence as a kind of bridge. It's like there's these like he uses semicolons and stuff in order to bridge ideas. But then in the Apocalypse Quartet, he emphasizes meandering structures. Now, meandering structures as in he barely uses any, again, like semicolons are not really, I mean there are some, but not as pronounced as his later style. But in the books, basically the meandering structure of the sentences underscores the droning apocalypse happening all throughout the series. And again, to reference George Szirtes, a vast river of type is essentially what Krasznahorkai was going for. And it's, in a way, it's like he's arriving at a kind of ominous music, which is, again, another theme throughout this series, but I'll touch on that later. Now, to illustrate to give you a picture of what kind of long sentences there are in these works, I'll have to start with the first, which is Satantango, I've noticed, like, upon a general survey of Satantango, like, the sentences in that book are basically shorter, and there are occasionally long sentences. It's like he's going for a kind of Thomas Bernhardt or Samuel Beckett style here, in that, well, yes, the sentences may be short or maybe occasionally long, but basically each chapter is like a long paragraph, occasionally jumbled. Like, for example, there's this one part in Satantango that's like the latter part of the story is like jumbled, disconnected, as if to illustrate a kind of dream sequence. But apart from that, it's mostly long paragraphs as chapters for Satantango. And it's only in Melancholy where we get a sense of the long sentences that he has. Long sentences exist in Melancholy, and they're especially longer here. And that these long sentences are clumped together in these numberless paragraphs that essentially act as like chapters. And again, in Satantango, right, I mentioned how there are a mix of short and long sentences bunched up into long paragraph length chapters. In Melancholy, it's mostly long sentences grouped into long paragraph length chapters without numbers. That's the style for that book. And for War and War, it's a unique structure as well, because you have sometimes short and mostly long sentences, but then each sentence is its own chapter. Like, for example, you get just one line, that's chapter 1. And then you get a whole sentence that spans 2 to 3 pages or what have you, and that's one chapter. And it's like numbered. Each chapter is numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and there are 7 parts full of these fragmented chapters, as if to illustrate, again, a kind of a broken reality. At least that's how I interpret it. And in Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming, here's the kicker. Again, it's mostly long, rarely short sentences, and it's as if each movement here is divided into French scenes. Now, French scenes as in there's no discernible paragraph break or anything. It's just scenes just proceed onward in like a style I could compare it to is like the French scene, like J.R. by William Gaddis, because like that book, it's not really told in chapters. It's just one continuous scroll of dialogue, and scenes just bleed into each other. In a way, like the scenes also bleed into each other in Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming, and that each scene, like for example, you have one chapter is dedicated to this character. Each scene is like one paragraph long, a one paragraph long sentence, and then the next scene is another character's perspective, which is like it's disorienting at first, but then the longer you read it, the more you get used to it, which is really what I appreciate. Like with the translation and all. Like if not for like the fluid translation of Szirtes and Mulzet, Ottilie Mulzet, these works would have not succeeded, but they have exponentially succeeded, in my opinion. Again, I've talked about the long sentences. Now I have to talk about the structure of the quartet. And since it's a quartet, another running theme, as I've said before, a running theme here is music. Now, the way that music figures is interesting. That, like for example, Satantango, by the name itself, tango, its structure in the book structure is a dance, basically. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it's like 6 steps forward, 6 steps back, something like that, as if to, and it's the circular narrative, almost as circular as Gravity's Rainbow, or almost as circular as 100 Years of Solitude, that kind of circular. And in Melancholy of Resistance, well, music also figures here, but then the 3-act structure solidifies this even further. Like music, in the sense that since a big part of Melancholy of Resistance is dedicated to Georgie Esther's exegesis of Andreas Werckmeister's music theory or musical notations, in the sense that Georgie Esther argued that Werckmeister's musical notations have proven to be a falsehood, and that the foundation of music is but a lie. And throughout the book, there's this discordant, like there may be a 3-act structure to separate all the action and everything, like the traditional 3-act structure, but then the story itself is almost discordant, almost violently out of tune, as if to underscore the theme of the harmonies established by Werckmeister, since they've been established to be a lie by Esther. It's like this whole work has this discordant tone to it, this discordant violent tone, so that's what I could describe it as. And for War and War, again, there's a 7-part structure. Music figures here, like, again, the music here maybe has to do with the fact that Krasznahorkai had carefully tuned the sentences, and the 7-part structure is really just a kind of surface veneer, but music isn't really a thing here, apart from brief flashes of here. And Baron Wenckheim, again, there's a musical score. Like the structure of music is very apparent in this book, because it opens with like a conductor telling his symphony orchestra to tighten up their act because he does not want to repeat it again. So it's like there's this metafictional frame over the entire thing, like to show you the structure I'm talking about. See here, you have the warning, which is basically the conductor telling the orchestra to tighten up its act. And then here you have the dance card. So you have radida. So, and it continues in a discordant series. It's like as if the entire book is like a warm-up for things to come, and it repeats the capo al fine once again with feeling here towards the end. So it's like it's implying that the apocalypse will be repeating over and over and over again. So yeah, that's the musical section done, or the music and how it figures in the structure of the quartet. And now we will be starting off with the quartet itself. And this video will be detailing each of the books in this quartet, starting, of course, from the very first Satantango, then the Melancholy of Resistance, then War and War, and then Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming. So, without further ado, here's the Apocalypse Quartet. So, book 1 of the quartet, then Satantango. This book begins essentially with infidelity. We see Futaki and Mishmit in a bed, and Futaki awakens to the sound of bells. And from there we get essentially a portrait of this town towards the tail end of communism in Hungary. This normal or ordinary backwoods town that's on the verge of falling apart. Everything is in disarray. Everything is in a state of such disheveled conditions. Like all of these remnants of all these systems just come to a head, essentially. And from these circumstances, people start to become aware of the return of one specific protagonist. This protagonist being Irimiash. Irimiash is, to give some context, in the book, Irimiash is this person who's been thought to be missing, or presumed dead, rather. And after about 2 or 3 years, he returns to this town. And people hear about this return, and people are in disbelief. They're like, Irimias, isn't he dead? Or hadn't he ran off with some money or something? Like, all of these negative ideas about Irimias come to a head. But then people believe that his coming means something, and that in anticipation of Irimias and his return, they try to work themselves up into a state of ecstasy, kind of, almost. But then before that, we get several portraits of different characters. Of course, there's Irimias himself, who is just coming to town. And Irimias, he and his partner in crime, Petrina, they go into this bureaucratic office in which they try to sort out some affairs before they set out to do what Irimias had planned, which was to set up a commune. And in order to do that, he had to go through a bureaucratic process, a very Kafkaesque process. And of course, they have to officialize everything first, but then it takes such a long process to do so. And in defeat, he goes to this bar and he rants about everything being like the world's gone mad, something like that. Like, he rants about all of these things. And when he gets to the bar, like, all these people, they might have taken him for someone important, because like everything just comes to a head at that bar. Like, he ranting about all of these things, all of these preoccupations in a circular way, much the same that I'm doing now. And after that section, we get a brief portrait of the doctor. The doctor here being this very passive character. He stays at home, he reads from a book, or he reads through many books. He observes minutiae and records them in notebooks. Like, for example, he'd record dust motes, or he'd record what happened outside his window in order to see everything unfolding from his vantage point, because he believes that by recording everything, he arrives at a state of such clear, unadulterated truth. And he transcribes everything into these notebooks of his. And by doing so, he slowly creates for us a portrait of the town, but from his perspective. Like, in a way, he's one of the more honest characters in Satantango, in that he tries to preserve as much of what he perceives to be true, and in doing so, kind of records a secret history of the town, or an unlikely history of what has come to unfold in this town. And alongside the doctor, there's another character here who is often called the idiot child, or the Horgos kid, who is called ST. But then in the movie by Bellatar, she's called Estik. So there's this kind of a bit of a name change there. But ST, she is in a sense like she's a kind of she's like the butt of every well, not really joke, but she's the butt of everything here in this book. Like, all the abuse that the world has to offer, she gets the brunt of it. Like, to give you an example, like, she has a brother, right? A brother, Sanye Orgos. Like, Sanye would keep on mistreating her, and he'd, like, for example, like, he once convinced her to pull some savings of hers, like all the coins she has or all the money she has. Like, Sanye convinced ST to bring those coins to a tree, like to plant those coins somewhere on a plot of land so that it will grow into a money tree. And then she does that, right? And maybe a few, like, some time passes, and then Sanye, uh, off screen, takes the money, and when ST returns to that place, like, the money's gone. And then she asks Sanye what happened, and then Sanye was like, "Don't you get it? I've I've uh, I've taken advantage of you," like something along those lines. And then it all comes to a head on this one day when ST, from her perspective, she takes her cat. Like, in the movie, it's like this graphic scene of just a cat being abused or maltreated. Like, ST drags their family cat, abuses, runs off with the cat to the barn, and then she subjects the cat to all kinds of physical abuse until it culminates into this incident in which she feeds it milk laced with rat poison, and then the pet cat partakes of this rat poison milk and dies. And once ST had finished with this abuse, she takes the dead cat with her to the ruins of an old manor, and there she ends herself. Basically, she ingests rat poison, and then she dies. And throughout this sequence of events, the fated Satantango also happens, in that as ST goes on this tangent, as the doctor goes on this tangent, and as Irimiash is slowly making his way to the town, the fated Satantango happens in the middle of the book, in which the residents, like Futaki, Mishmet, the Halixos, so on and so forth, they congregate in this bar, and it is here that they work themselves to a state of ecstasy, in a state of kind of merry, in order to like in cheerful anticipation of of Irimiash and Petrina. And by the end of it, they are so drunk, they are so out of it, that they fall to drunken stupor, they collapse. And then when Irimiash arrives silently after the end of the dance, he finds everything in such a disarrayed state. And after that, they hold a service to ST, because off screen she is discovered, like her body is discovered, like the Horgos mother grieves, even though she doesn't really care, like none of the Horgoses care about ST. And but then it's all an act. Okay, so it is during these sequence of events that Irimias, during the service, makes a speech decrying the state of the town, decrying the cowardice of the inhabitants of this town, and that they should be ashamed for their cowardly behavior, and that like ST is the one innocent light that's been snuffed out, something like that. And by the end of it, Irimiash, in a ploy to salvage the situation, he promises to the people of the town that the money he will gather from them will be used to start a commune in which they will be better off than the current circumstances that they live in. So after that, he after this speech, people actually give him money. They, like Futaki, I believe he was the first to give him money, and then the rest of the people follow suit. And then Irmias is like, no, you shouldn't have, no. But then he resolves to go, and he will like return with news about what to do, right? And he sets off. And the people at this stage, taken in by the words of Irmias, they go their separate ways after the bar, and they go home, pack their things. Some even destroyed their homes in the process of moving and repacking their things, because they believe that by doing so, they wouldn't invite any Roma or any gypsy people who might want to take their belongings after they've fled to the new commune, so to speak. The new commune being somewhere in, I believe it was Almaty Manor. And so after that, they set up on a procession towards the manor in which they were to build their commune. And it is there that they wait out the entire trip. Like, they wait in anticipation of Irimiash. And some people don't, like, some of the residents start to lose faith in that they've wrecked their homes, they've done all of this, they've given their money to Irimiash, but then he doesn't show. Because like Irimiash, I believe he promised that he will show, like in a few days, he will appear at this day, at this time. But then the time passes, and so the people believed that he had not made good on his promise. So that I believe Schmidt got into an argument with Futaki, broke his nose, and then like everyone kind of settled down after that. And later Schmidt apologized to Futaki, and all of them have dreams of, like, all of them, when they went off to bed that night on the cold ground in that old abandoned manor, they had dreams of their own, dreams that somehow relate to Irmiash returning. And while this was happening, Irmiash and Petrina go on a separate tangent in order to return to, like, on the way back from the center after yet another deliberation with like the bureaucracy. Like, they, like, after finding out that they would need more permits and stuff, and of course Irimiash was very frustrated with the whole Kafkaesque proceeding, so he returns with Petrina and Sanyi, because Sanyi has since then joined Petrina and Irimiash. And so Irimiash, he alluded to Petrina that what he was doing is playing the long game, but what long game that is not answered. Like, I will leave that I will leave that as it is for you to form your own conclusions. But after Irimiash finds all the people in that manor, that abandoned manor, he reassures the people that he's returned, and that, of course, he's just a man walking to and from his destination. Like, they do a lot of walking in this book, as much walking as in the movie. I mean, it's as if he's going on a Lord of the Rings tangent every time. Like, he does, like, there's these long sequences of walking here in this book. That's all I can say. And so Irmiash, going back to the main story, Irmiash goes to the manor. He finds the people cold, huddled up in a corner, and he reassures them, "I've returned. Why do some of you doubt me? Have I not returned?" Something like that. And so, in order to show them that he has made good on their promise, he takes them on a truck to the outskirts, and it is there that they separate. All of them separate because Irmiash has a plan for each one of them set out. So in a sense, like for example, Futaki is to remain in place doing this job, and then the Halexes go off to that place, and the Schmidts go to this place, and he leaves them with references so that they'd know who to find or which building number to find. And all of this is his ploy to like scatter, like he has this ploy of scattering all of the town residents so that one day when communism ends, maybe they'd finally make good on their realized plans for a commune, when they wouldn't have to deal with the Kafka's proceedings and all, because like communism has ended, and so they were free to do whatever they want. But for the meantime, they had to spread themselves out to all these parts of Hungary, to all these parts of wherever, so that one day, when the time comes for them to go back together, they would have the commune in place. And it ends like all of the resident stories end at that point, and it's only when we go back to the office, and in which we see the clerks type up a report about Irmiash and his circumstances, and that they have retyped Irmiash's observations of like his real observations of the people involved, like a kind of character profiles that border along character assassination. Like for example, Miss Schmidt has been portrayed as an unflattering prostitute, and the typists have to figure out a more government or more politically correct term to like straighten out the language that Eremias has used to illustrate all of these residents, right? Residents. Like the clerks essentially had to read through his entire testimony and his entire profiles of people involved in this specific commune, so that they would be able to file it. And so the rest of their people have already left the office, and after they've left, they're still there, still rewriting that report. And as they were doing the retyping and all the reordering of politically correct terms, they cursed Iremias for his unprofessionalism. And yeah, that's about it. And of course, the very last part of the book is essentially the doctor, like everything from the perspective of the doctor, basically. Like he is looking at his notebook, and he is looking over the previous entries from the days prior, and he looks at he looks out through the window and sees all of these structures, like seemingly, like, because like the doctor, like in the midst of this frenzy of moving, he's been left behind. Like he doesn't even know that he's the only person left in that town. Not until well, he doesn't know, rather. He doesn't know that he's the only person left in town. But a kind of event, another event happens in which he hears the tolling of the bells, basically, and he investigates the tolling of the bells, which leads him to an abandoned church. And in this abandoned church, he sees a homeless man, or kind of hobo, banging on a pipe almost, and like a pipe, or like the remnants of a bell, I forget. But he witnesses this happening, and the homeless guy slash hobo does this, and the doctor takes notice, and he asks him, "What are you doing?" Or like something along the lines of, "What are you doing?" And then he listens to what this homeless hobo slash homeless guy says, and he hears the Turks are coming, over and over again. And so after that, the doctor, he goes back to his house and boards up all the openings, all his windows. He boards them up with plywood, with planks. And in the darkness, after he boarded up all his windows, in the darkness, he looks at his notebook again. He looks at his notebooks. He tries to see the truth in those entries, and in doing so, he arrives at this point in which as he is, in this sense, an unconscious god, he rewrites, or rather writes, the beginning of the book, which is essentially: one morning, near the end of October, not long before the first drops of the mercilessly long autumn rains began to fall on the cracked and saline soil on the western side of the estate, later the stinking yellow sea of mud would render footpaths impassable and put the town to beyond reach. Futaki woke to hear bells, on and on. So, basically, the doctor, as he reached such a state of godlike, kind of like to himself, perhaps, like godlike foresight or godlike tendencies, like he conjured up in his notebook as he's writing, he conjured up the ending, which is also the beginning. And so, in a way, the cycle repeats itself. And that is where the story ends for Satantango. So, in a sense, Satantango is this essentially circular narrative. It starts from a point of infidelity and so on, but then we find out that that part has been written onto existence by the doctor, who is a kind of unconscious god, kinda. Yeah. So after that, we have book 2, which is the Melancholy of Resistance. Here we go. And so this book is essentially Krasznahorkai's take on the coming of the Leviathan, to reference a review that W.G. Sebald had made about this book, which is, in his words, like, this is a book about a world into which the Leviathan is returned. So yes, the Leviathan in question being the dead whale. But before we get to that section, we have an introduction of a rather minor character who doesn't figure much towards the bulk of the book, but then she may be a minor character, but she's a kind of silent anchor towards this whole book as well. This character being Miss Plough. And Miss Plough, she is, in this book, making her way to her train, and in this train ride, she comes into contact with a lot, like, she endures a lot during this train ride. She tries to contend with the cramped carriages the leering men. In particular, there's this one man that was sitting opposite her in this ride, who kept staring at her breasts, kept staring at her whole entire soul, and made her feel as if she was naked. And in an effort to get away from this man, this lech, she changes carriages. And she was also hiding in, I think, the bathroom at one point, and then she exited from the bathroom. And while she was in the bathroom, she heard the voice of this lech outside. He was like, he said something along the lines of, "What? You're such a tease. Like all that show, and for what? You're such a tease." Something like that. And so she exits from the bathroom, and then she makes her way towards another carriage, where she hopefully wants to avoid the man. And the man somehow ends up in the same carriage as she is, but then he doesn't see where she is. And so she gets into this carriage, and she is sitting right near a woman who laments about all of these things. Like she talks of all these mundane things, and then Miss Pluff couldn't care less, and so she stares off into space while she lets this woman rattle on and on about whatever she's talking about. And after the end of this train journey, she heads home to this town, that might bear a striking resemblance to the center, to the town or to the city center that Satantango is set in, albeit different, slightly different. And because that's the thing, before I continue, that's the thing that I've noticed with these books. Like, all of these books seem to revolve around the same locale, right? Because we see repeated mentions of structure, like, for example, Wenckheim Manor, Almaty Manor, the square, all of these places repeatedly mentioned, which gives it the background of slowly building up this portrait of what an apocalypse is for this specific part of what I assume to be a normal composite Hungarian city or a Hungarian town. Okay, now to go back. So Miss Pluff, as I mentioned, got off the train, and so as she was walking outside the station, she is greeted by darkness, because this town that she where she lives, for some reason all the street lights are out, and she hears gangs roaming around. A person gets beat up. It's all dark. Krasznahorkai really hits home with the darkness here, and she barely, to her mind, escapes within an inch of her life because of this. And when she gets home, she collapses out of exhaustion. But then, before she could rest, another visitor comes to see her, and this visitor is one Miss Esther. And basically, she just asks around about how he is, how she's doing, how her son is doing. Her son being Janos Baluska. Baluska being an important, he's the main character of this book. And so, Miss Pluff, of course, to give a bit of context, Miss Pluff finds Balushka to be a failure. Because to her mind, Baluska is just whiling his time away, drinking, staying out at night. All of these things that bring shame upon her, she thinks. So Miss Esther asks for a favor from her. I forget what, but she makes her promise, and then she promises, and then Miss Esther, of course, leaves, and then she intends to leave for Baluska. But then before that, we get to Beluska's episode in which, okay, so this is the part, this might be my favorite part in this whole book, like the Beluska episodes. Basically, in this section, Beluska, he is at the P. Pfeffer, which is this bar, right? And so in this bar, he reenacts the alignment of the heavenly bodies. And so he taps one bar goer. He says, "You're the sun." Then another one's the moon. And then another one's the earth. And so he recreates this dance of, like, essentially he recreates what is essentially the solar eclipse, which is the moon here. Wait, so the earth is here, for example, and then the sun is here, and then all of a sudden the moon obscures the sun, and all we are left with is an outline of the sun, the corona of the sun, and then the moon moves away, and then the sun is back, right? And so, like, it is this very hypnotic section, right? Let me see if I can read this to you, just so you can see what this is, like, this experience is for me. Here it is, sorry for that. The brilliant light of the sun, whose broad gesture took in the driver, who ground his teeth, struggling against the sea of troubles besetting him, and extended to the hypnotically circling figure of the house painter, floods earth with warmth and light. The side of earth is facing it, that is. He gently steadied the lewdly grinning representation of earth, and turned him to face the sun. Then stepped behind him, leaning on him, almost embracing him, craning over his shoulder, the intense look on his face suggesting he was merely the medium for the others, and blinked at what he termed the blinding radiance of the unsteady driver. We are standing in this resplendence, then. Suddenly, we see only that the round disk of the moon. Here he grabbed Sergei and propelled him from this orbit around the sun, around the house painter, to an intermediary position between the sun and the earth. That the round disk of the moon creates an indentation, a dark indentation on the flaming body of the sun. And this indentation keeps growing. You see? Again, he emerged from behind the house painter and gave a gentle shove to the almost terminally furious but helpless warehouseman. You see? And soon enough, as the moon's cover extends, we see nothing but this brilliant sickle of sunlight in the sky. And the next moment, whispered Beluska in a voice choking with excitement, running his eyes to and fro in a straight line between driver, warehouseman, and house painter. Let us say it is 1 p.m. We shall witness a most dramatic turn of events because, unexpectedly, within a few minutes, the air about us cools. Can you feel it? The sky darkens and then grows perfectly black. Guard dogs howl. The frightened rabbit flattens itself against the grass. Herds of deer are startled into a mad stampede. And in this terrible, incomprehensible twilight, even the birds! Cried Beluska, in rapture, throwing his arms up to the sky, his ample postman's cloak flapping open like bat's wings. The very birds are confused and settle on their nests. And then, silence. And every living thing is still, and we too, for whole minutes, are incapable of speech. Are the hills on the march? Will heaven fall in on us? Will earth open up under our feet and swallow us? We cannot tell. It is a total eclipse of the sun. So that is part of that chapter, and I believe you should, I'll stop right there because, I don't want to spoil that part for you, but it is a very beautiful chapter, indeed. That very beautiful section. And after that whole episode with the heavenly bodies and everything, Beluska and the rest of the bar hoppers get kicked out. And after that, Beluska walks home. And before he walks home, he sees this structure, this truck, pulling something along, like this big trailer of sheet metal, and he sees this whole lumbering weight moving to the square, and he wonders what that is. And he like he finds out that it is a whale, a dead whale's corpse that comes to the town. And again, parallels to Leviathan coming, which signifies the end of the world in the Bible. And so, from there, things spiral out of control. And chaos and order are essentially full on either end. And some of these manifestations of chaos and order are, like, for example, take Georgie Esther, the husband, the estranged husband of Miss Esther. Georgie Esther, by way of Andreas Werckmeister, mentioned how music is insufficient in resolving the problem of the universe's inevitable decay, because, as I mentioned in the introduction, Andreas Werckmeister, in attempting to form a musical notation, attempts to reconcile the harmonies, like natural harmony. He argues that Werckmeister's harmonies are a falsehood, and that it is an imperfect system in which to hinge all of music. Like, in a way, by making the proposition, like by Werckmeister making the proposition that the 5-note musical notation is elegant, it betrays a kind of falsehood that seems to lead to a collapse in understanding. It is this idea that pervades the entirety of the book. Basically, the instability underlying the circumstances surrounding the arrival of the dead whale, right? And so this is not the only compromise that happens here, the one with music. Like, in this section is especially notable because Esther, as the people are preoccupied with the matter of the dead whale, Miss Esther slowly plots to take over the town by way of her slogan, a clean house, an orderly home. In a way, like, she wants to take back order in the town. And so, in the midst of chaos, she forms this coalition together with the chief of police and with all these other concerned individuals in a ploy to, again, take back the town. And so she also puts Voluska up to the task of, like, in the book she almost makes Voluska her errand boy, in that she wants Voluska to tell Georgie Esther that if Georgie Esther does not make the people sign the petition that she has, she will move in with him at a specific time, and to prove it, she brought her suitcase along. And he broke the news to Georgie, and so Georgie was like, no way that's happening, because I despise that woman. I want nothing to do with my ex-wife. But he is eventually convinced because of, again, Voluska really insists that Georgie do what Esther tells him to do. And so he proceeds out of the town, and he gathers up all of these grievances from these citizens, right? Because, like, they believe Georgie Esther to be an upstanding member of the town. They air out their grievances to him, believing that he would do something about them, but then he gets overwhelmed, and so he, in an effort to placate these people, promises that he will make good on whatever needs to be made good. And so he moves away from the crowd. Voluska leads him to the square, and in the square he notices people lining up to see the whale, and he wants Georgie to see the whale, and then Georgie says maybe some other time. But then Voluska notices that the people in the square, they are at this sort of breaking point. It's as if there's a kind of calm before like there's this calm before the storm, right? And so Georgie, or rather Valuska, noticing this, he lines up to see the whale, right? After parting ways with Georgie not long after. He wants to see the whale, and so he pays to see the whale, and he surveys the entire body of this whale. And in observing this body, like he is like the act of looking at the whale's dead corpse induces something in him, like a kind of melancholy, silent. This whale does something to him, right? And he comes away a bit perplexed. Like the more he thinks about the whale, the more he examines reality, the madness begins to show. Like reality examined to the point of madness, as outlined in, like, to use the line, that famous line in War and War, which I will talk about very soon. But yeah, reality examined to the point of madness, which is the entire core of this book, and which has also been introduced by, I believe, Weiss Mailing List in his review of Melancholy. But throughout this scene, like the silent congregations of people in the square, and Valuska's encounter with the whale, right? There's another scene that happens not too long after, right? In which Valuska, upon his subsequent visit to the whale, overhears a conversation between the ringmaster and the so-called, a so-called person who works for the prince. The prince being like the star, another star of the show for the ringmaster of the dead whale circus, right? And so this envoy of the prince tells the ringmaster, like, this isn't working out anymore, and so he wants out. And so the ringmaster, obviously, he says he can no longer take any disrespect and any, like, he doesn't want anything to do with the prince anymore. And so it is here that the envoy tells him that the people will be expecting the prince anytime soon, and that there will be a riot. And like towards the latter half of the book, there's these violent riots that break out, right? And so Valuska, somehow he ends up in one of these riots after he's been pulled into one by a random stranger who gave him a bottle to drink, right? And he ended up going along with this riot, right? And this riot took him as far as a hospital, took him as far as this, like the house of this police chief, right? And he witnesses all of these acts of terror that unfold upon the town, right? And in this chaos, he might have watched his mother get killed right before his eyes, but then he was too numb to do anything about it. He might have also seen a few patients from a few patients in a hospital get beaten up, or an infirmary get beaten up and upended, and like chaos just suddenly broke all throughout the town. Like everything is in disarray, and by the end of it, he finds a manuscript or a notebook outlining an atrocity that happened in a location somewhere that involved homeless people, I think. And Valuska reads this and was horrified, and he essentially branded a fugitive later on. How that happens is because he has been wrapped up in the riots, and so Esther believes that, like Miss Esther believes that he is going to be one of the people named, right? And so he has to get out of there. In his absence, right? Because he's been told to escape by way of the tracks. And so he makes his way there. As that was happening, Georgie Esther, he wanted to look for Valuska, right? And so Valuska is eventually found after some time. And he doesn't see the same Valuska that he saw back then, like the wide-eyed, innocent Valuska, because like during that the riots changed something in him, and so he has this, again, the title plays out like here, like the Melancholy of Resistance. Like there is a kind of silent, bittersweet melancholy, in the sense that as they're resisting the decay of morality, the decay of everything happening, and as they are witnessing this upheaval, the social collapse, they couldn't help but feel a kind of bittersweet longing or yearning, or a kind of melancholy, again, as to play into the title. It ends with a sermon by the grave, like Miss Esther's sermon to Miss Plough. Because again, there's a brief shot in that book in which Valuska had seen his mother violated and killed right before his eyes, and the service for Miss Plough had Miss Esther say a eulogy, and then it caps off with this brilliantly macabre and brilliantly bleak illustration of Miss Plough decaying and like absolute futility, as if to underscore the line in the epigraph in the beginning: "It passes, but does not pass away." Here, it ground the empire into carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and sulfur. It took its delicate fibers and unstitched them till they were dispersed and had ceased to exist, because they had been consumed by the force of some incomprehensibly distant edict, which must also consume this book here, now, at the full stop after the last word. So not only do we have Miss Plough decaying, we also have this book decaying, which is to say that everything passes, but they do not pass away. So that is the Melancholy of Resistance. And next up we have War and War. So this book essentially begins in a point of danger, right? You have Corin, the archivist character, as he is on a run-in with these street urchins that he is run into by railroad tracks, right? And so instead of running away, what he does is tell them in excruciating detail his entire life story, how he'd ended up the failure that he was, right? So what Corin essentially told them was the very start of his descent into failure, right? Before that, he had a job, a decent job. I mean, he still had the job, but he worked as an archivist. He was making steady progress, and he had a wife, he had a home. But once he got entangled with Hermes, that's when it all came downhill. Now, from the excerpt related here, in a later part, not with the street urchins, but in a later part, it was Hermes, said Corin. Hermes lay at the heart of everything. That was his starting point. That was the foundation of his deepest intellectual experiences. And though he had never spoken of this to anyone before, he simply had to tell the young lady stewardess that it was to Hermes he had ultimately led, having, time after time, attempted to discover that hermetically sealed beginning, had time after time attempted to understand it, to solve it, to get to the bottom of it, and not least of all to recount it to those people that fate had so far brought him into contact with. to tell them how it was that he realized that he was not intended to be an ordinary archivist, not that he didn't want to be an archivist. For indeed he was most sincerely an archivist, but not an ordinary one. And what he sought to discover, what he constantly sought the answer to, was the reason why he was an ordinary. And so he kept going over and over things that had happened, extending his explorations ever further back in time. And there was always something there, something new about his past that made him think, this is it, I've got it. Or rather, he searched and searched for the source, the origo of this revolution in his life, which eventually, some 30 or 40 hours ago, had led him here and to ever newer potential sources and origos, ever newer starting points and beginnings, until he reached the conclusion, he was pleased to say, the actual conclusion he had been seeking, and the name of that conclusion was Hermes. For truly, he said, Hermes, for him, was the absolute origo. It was that encounter with the Hermetic, the day, the hour he first encountered Hermes, when, if he might so put it, he became acquainted with the world of the Hermetic and was afforded a glimpse into it, into that which Hermes presented as a world, the world of which Hermes was the ruler. Hermes, this Greek god, the 12th of 12, with this mystery, his lack of fixity, his copiously multifaceted existence, his secret forms, the dark side of his being shrouded in a deeply suggestive silence, who had had such a mesmerizing effect on his imagination, or more precisely, had completely captured his imaginative faculties and made him restless, had drawn him into a sphere from which there was no escape, for it was like being under a spell or a curse or an incantation, since this was what Hermes was to him, not a god who led, but one who misled, swept him off course, destabilized him, called him, drew him aside, seduced him from below, whispered to him from the wings. But why him? Him in particular? Why this archivist working some 220 kilometers from Budapest? He could not tell, nor should he seek after reasons, he felt, but simply accept that that was the way it was. It was the way he learned of Hermes, possibly through the Homeric hymns, or maybe from the psychoanalyst Kerenyi, possibly from the marvelous graves. Who the hell knew or cared how, said Corin, this being, if he might so put it that way, the induction phase, which was quickly followed by the next phase, the phase of deeper exploration, in which the towering, unrivaled work of Walter F. Otto, that is to say his Digotter Griechenlands, was the sole guide, and in that book exclusively one specific chapter in the Hungarian edition, which he read and reread, until it came to pieces in his hands, which was the point at which restlessness and anxiety entered his life, when things were no longer as they were, the day after which everything looked different, had changed, when the world showed him its most terrifying face, bringing on a sense of dissociation, offering the most terrifying aspect of absolute freedom, since knowledge of Hermes, said Corin, entails the loss of one's sense of being at home in this world, of the sense of belonging, of dependence, of certainty, and this means that suddenly there is an uncertainty factor in the totality of things, because, just as suddenly, it becomes clear that in this uncertainty is the sole factor, for Hermes signifies the provisional and relative nature of the laws of being, and Hermes brings and Hermes takes such laws away, or rather, allows them liberty. For that is the whole point of Hermes, said Corin to the stewardess. So yeah, it goes on and on for that long. But, long story short, Corin relates to the urchins how he discovered Hermes, and how going down the Hermes rabbit hole led to such a disastrous outcome for him and his marriage. They had fallen apart, he had broken off the marriage, he had sunken himself deeper and deeper into the world of Hermes, the relativity of things, examining reality to the point of madness, until such time that he has lost his grip on reality and things went down south. But that is before he discovers in the archive rather, he discovers a manuscript located in a box labeled Family Papers of No Further Significance, something like that. And that manuscript, he read the manuscript, he found it life-changing, he wanted to do something about letting it out to the world, so that they too could experience the power of this manuscript. This manuscript is basically the MacGuffin of this whole book. But before we get to that part, now skipping aside all the interludes, right? So he eventually finds the moment to escape the street urchins, and he resolves to packing up, selling everything, converting everything to cash that he sews into a coat along with the manuscript, and he leaves Hungary, goes to this travel agency where he relates the same story of how he discovered Hermes, right? And another thing, like just to give a quick tangent, I found a few references in here interesting before that segment, right, the travel agency segment, because I noticed there was a part in this story in which he related Krasznahorkai reference Balaton, right? And Balaton, if you must know, is a band. It's a real band, and the lead singer is Mihaly Vig, who happens to have played the lead in Sátántangó, which is one of the leads in Satantango, which was Irimiash. So that was a fun tidbit right there. And going back to tangent over. So going back to the main story, he finds the next flight out to Hungary from Hungary is like he goes through a process of elimination, right? And so he eventually settles on New York, because to him New York is the center of the world. And so without further ado, he picked New York, the next flight out to New York. He arrived in New York, was assaulted upon landing, and he got a taste of the immigrant experience, so to speak. He switches from flop house to flop house until such time that he eventually makes the acquaintance of an interpreter. The same interpreter that helped him enter New York, or enter America, and who consequently had lost his job because of him, because of Corin, right? And so when Corin makes the acquaintance of the interpreter again, the interpreter, of course, he was pissed off at Corin for all the inconvenience he put him through, right? This interpreter named Joseph Sarvery. And so Corin, of course, he begged Sarvery, the interpreter, he begged to live with Sarvery, right? Because Sarvery was Hungarian, and Corin doesn't know English, doesn't know a lick of English, and so he needed the interpreter, right? And so the interpreter agrees, but on a few conditions, right? Like he has to give the money up front, and so he does, right? And Corin has a few stipulations of his own, in that he needed internet, he needed a quiet space within the apartment, the interpreter's apartment, and he is only to remain in that room working, right? And eventually they come to an agreement, and before long, Corin moves in with the interpreter. And another tangent here. What I found out even before I read War and War was that Krasznahorkai actually spent some time with Allen Ginsberg in New York while he was writing this book. And I wonder as to the degree of verisimilitude in that the interpreter's actions might reflect Ginsberg, or might have inspired Ginsberg might have inspired some parts of the interpreter. We don't know for sure, but yeah, tangent over. So that's what happened, right? And as the days went on, Corin chipped at the manuscript, uploaded it to the internet, and he relates the story of the manuscript, right? So it's essentially about these brothers in arms, 4 brothers in arms, who wash up on Crete during the Minoan civilization, right? So we have these 4 brothers in arms who, again, have interestingly enough, they have names that do not match the time period at all, as if they're what's the word? It's like they don't match the time period. They are so out of place. We have Bengaza, Tut, Kasser, and Falk, right? So these four brothers in arms try to make their way through the Minoan civilization, and they find that it is like they might get used to life here, but then all of a sudden there's this masked figure, not masked, like hooded figure rather, hooded, emaciated looking figure who is the absolute picture of death, called Masked Man. And once he arrives, right, suddenly the civilization falls into disrepair, or suddenly experiences hardship, right? And so the four brothers in arms once again take to getting out of Crete because Masked Man has somehow found them. So it's like there's this endless game of cat and mouse happening, in which the four brothers in arms always try to evade Masked Man, in a sense echoing the chase of history, right? To use James Joyce, like the nightmare of history. And so these four brothers in arms, they hop from time period to time period in order to evade this figure, Masked Man, right? Who comes in many different incarnations as well. Like you have them, aside from Crete, they move through a cathedral in Germany, Cologne, right? They move to Venice. They also move to Rome, like Roman times, right? And all those periods have Masked Man in some way, shape, or form appear in different guises, right? So you never escape. You never truly escape the history from which you are trying to run away from, is what this manuscript is essentially getting at. And while these shenanigans are happening in the manuscript, and while Corin is working away at that manuscript, he makes the acquaintance of, or not really makes the acquaintance of, the interpreter's partner, live-in partner, who is a very passive character. She just listens to him listens to him ramble on and on in Hungarian, and she can't understand a lick of what he's saying, but she stays anyway, tries to hear him out. And as all of this is happening, in the background, you have the interpreter trying to make ends meet, trying to do some shady illicit activities, which led to the apartment at one point being stripped of all of its belongings, right? As if those things have been repossessed because of some misunderstanding, and they won't be put back until a few days later. And so during that time, Corin has entered into this maddening state in which he is just trying to work on his manuscript and all of that, and he discovers some things about the interpreter that he'd rather unlearn. And eventually it culminates in a shooting. And after that happened, he had to move out of the apartment, or rather he ran out of fear from that apartment, and so found himself wandering New York, trying to ask for directions to the Hungarian quarter of New York, until he ends up in the quarter and he makes the acquaintance of someone called Gyula Százbo, who is a proprietor of some bar, right? And he makes the acquaintance of Százbo and finds him quite a pleasure to talk to about his life, and so stayed with him for a bit. And when Corin reached his apartment one time, and he was looking around and he sees a picture on the wall, and he asks Százbo, "What is that? Where is that from?" He said, "Schaffhausen, somewhere near Geneva, Switzerland." And so at that moment, Corin, because he is one to give in to his whims, books the next flight out of New York to Europe in order to get to Schaffhausen, in hopes of delivering to the world his story, the manuscript, and in order to well, I won't reveal what else happens, but that is War and War. And we have the capstone of it all, the capstone project, which is Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming. Now, as I mentioned before, this is structured like a symphony. The first part is a warning. Think of it like a conductor warning his audience, or warning not only his audience, but the symphony itself, warning them to keep their act together so that they won't have to do this again, right? And so, this book, apart from being about the Baron, of course, is about a few other characters. Interestingly enough, we don't open with the Baron, right? We open with a professor, the professor and his daughter, right? The professor is a bit different from the doctor in Satantango, but they might as well be similar in some respect. But the professor here is, he studied moss, right? And so one day while shopping for vegetables, he found out that he doesn't want to be an expert in moss anymore. Like, he's so tired of the pompousness of it all. And so he drops his academic title, he drops his research, and goes to live in a backwater part of the town, like some scraggly underbrush with hungarocell, like a home made of hungarocell panels, which is just a fancy term for styrofoam. So you have this professor turning into a madman living in a styrofoam house, basically. And so one day he has his daughter, or someone who claims to be his daughter that he hasn't seen in many years, right, come to him with a news crew. And so she demands to see him, but then he shoots at somewhere near, like he shoots at the outside of his house, telling them to stay away. And then the daughter took that for a sign that he didn't want, he had nothing to do, he wanted nothing to do with her, right? And this attracted the attention of neo-Nazis, right? You had the leader and his right-hand little star. And they had a proposition to help the professor because they are ardent fans of the professor. But then the professor didn't want them to intervene. And so they, they took that as a sign that, okay, we're going to try again another time to convince you of that you need our help. But then what ended up happening was when the right hand of the leader, Little Star, came back, the professor accidentally killed him, and after that he's been on the run ever since. And that's where the story ends for the professor for the meantime, because after that it switches on to another track altogether with the Baron, right? The Baron is somewhere in Europe. Like he stops. He travels with a steward, right, or a caretaker, and the caretaker entrusts the Baron to a conductor, a train conductor, and he says to the conductor, he has to get to this station. He does not need to be disturbed. He could get overstimulated. All of these other things, because the Baron is a very weird character here. So the context is the Baron is he's just trying to get out of South America from his gambling debts, and so he ends up in Europe for no particular reason than to just go back to the town in which he grew up, right? And so he's been through these hoops. Many chapters of his family have come to his aid, and now he's somewhere in Europe being boarded on a train, and the caretaker leaves him there with the conductor. And the conductor tries to offer his services to the Baron, but then the Baron does not want to do that. What's nothing to do with anyone, right? He'd rather keep to himself. He's very quiet. He's very non-verbal, and the conductor had a hard time of it all. And on the train, he manages to capture the attention of one Dante, right? Dante, who is described as a kind of opportunistic this opportunistic fellow, right, who tries to scheme, since he is aware that the Baron is a very important person, right, and he tries to sweet talk his way into helping the Baron deal with whatever, right? Because apparently many people have heard of him coming back to, or with like the plans of him going back to his town, because he has made it all over the papers, the tabloids. They've talked about how he is running away from South America, and he has ended up in Hungary, on the way to the town in which he was born, right? And he is also, and then there are also these other parallel narratives, like for example Dora, who is related to America, who happens to have known the Baron, or who claims to have been the object of the Baron's affection for many years, like when they were still very young. And you also have Aunt Ibolica, who is this caretaker of the professor, who still insists that he return to his normal functions. And the police chief, of course, the same police chief, possibly from the Melancholy of Resistance. You have the neo-Nazis. You also have a brief appearance from Miss Esther, same Esther from the Melancholy of Resistance again. And you also have some mention of the Halixes, right? The Halixes from Satantango, except these Halixes are the descendants of the Halixes from Sátántangó. Because this book, Báró Wenckheim's Homecoming, is set in the 2010s, I'd imagine, because there are many contemporary references. Like, for example, I've heard mention of Eminem, which is surprising that Krasznahorkai includes Eminem in this book. And again, I also managed to catch a reference to Mihaly Vig, again, another real person, the same person who was the lead in Balotan. And of course, the Baron, since people have heard of him apparently coming to the town, the mayor insisted on preparations before his arrival. So the mayor constantly spouts on about these activities having to be done, like a Satantango to be done, well, which echoes the first book, of course, of the Quartet. And you also have these absurd activities lists, right? And all in the name of sweetening the deal for the Baron to help his townsfolk, of course, as he should, which is what they think. And when the Baron arrived, finally, after going through the train and heading first to his family chapter, like that chapter in his family residence, in which they did not know how to receive him because he was very distant, he is very weird, like he is very nonverbal. And when he went to the town, when he arrived, he was so overstimulated that he could not enjoy the company of the people, or he was not enjoying himself, he was very overstimulated, right? And the mayor did not understand if he was failing, right? And there was a lot of chaos that unfolded internally and externally. And as this chaos was happening with the Baron's arrival and all, you had another tangent with the professor in which he outlines the nature of reality. He outlines the mistakes that people have made and the nature of history. Like, there are many of these meditations that he gets into, and again, science, of course, like science and reality and history. And he talks about all of this to a dog that he adopted. He was at first hesitant to have anything to do with, but then he eventually adopted while he was on the run. And while this was happening, the professor also made a plan, right? He had walked into a bar and wanted to hire a person to dig holes around his property, the one with his property with the styrofoam house built on it. right? And he wanted them to dig holes after he had poured gas all over the property. Now, as to how he acquired the gas, he also went to a gas station. Duh. Like he went because like the context is the town that supposedly the professor was in had no more gas reserves. But then when the professor went to this gas station with the attendant. He essentially held them up with the same shotgun he used to accidentally kill Little Star. And the attendant knew that there were reserves because he apparently was in on some arrangement with his boss that there was still gas, right? And since he couldn't care less, he gave the gas away to the professor for a set amount, and the attendant spoke of nothing else and just left the matter at that because he was too smart for his own good. And so he dumped the gas all over the field, and a few days later had someone dig holes around the property, and then all of a sudden, like there's news of his land in flames, and the people wondered why it smelled strongly of gas in that area when they knew full well that there was no more gas left in the entire town, right? And of course, as this was happening, you had the Baron, going back to the Baron, right? He was also alienated, he was so isolated, and Marika was embarrassed because the Baron had snubbed her, and so people wondered about her, about Marika. She was scandalized by that whole thing, and so was left speechless, and her friend had to come and talk her out of this depression, this slump that she had found herself in, right? And the Baron had such a hard time adjusting, right? He stayed at the newly, or not really newly, like it was still a very incomplete restoration, right? He slept for the meantime at Wenckheim Manor, which used to be an orphanage, and so prior to his arrival, the mayor had ordered for many orphans who already lived there to be vacated, and so they were left without homes, while the Baron arrived at the manor, was taken to the manor, and realized that there were no beds available for him to sleep on, and so he's just slept on a plank of wood. And the carpenter in charge of making the beds was so distraught over the whole thing that he he was so distraught that he hadn't even completed the work, and yet here was the Baron in such a wretched state, and so he tucked him in and just left in a huff, right? And after that, when the Baron exited the manor and rode a taxi, Dante showed up once again, and so this conniving, opportunistic fellow once again crosses paths with the Baron, and so he manages to weasel his way into his life once again, directs him to a bar in which they hide out the next few days before anything else happens. And there is one point in which wherein the Baron actually sneaks out to the forest and ends up on the railways, and something tragic happens, but I won't outline that here. I'll leave that undiscovered. And after that tragic thing happens, there is a letter allegedly attributed to the Baron that is addressed to the Hungarians. And in that letter, prominent individuals are named, like namely the police chief, the mayor, the librarian, people from all branches of power or influence in that town are named. And apparently he had no flattering words for all of them. And so I want to read an excerpt from that letter. The human being is a monstrosity. I hope I am not too late in speaking, he read, reaching the last line in the column, where he had to turn the page. A monstrosity! He raised his head to the first line on the next page and pushed his eyeglasses farther up his nose. A fact of which you are all undoubtedly well aware. As to no avail are his continual lies flowing unimpeded in every direction. Moreover, this true monstrosity, while he has his bad moments, at times stumbles across a good intention within himself, but he quickly forgets about that, and it remains a mere memory, but he builds upon it later. As the sort of monstrosity is convinced that fate has selected him for good, or at the very least as the representative of truth, his own truth, or his own truth as vindicated by others. And in this he stands very close to the so-called Christian, who is exactly the same but even worse, because he continually calls upon a particular alliance with his own Almighty Lord, an alliance through which he exempts himself time and time again, from every kind of outrage amongst which he lives, and he lies, because for him, to live and to lie are two sides of one and the same coin, and that's what makes the Christian so repulsive. But the Christian Hungarian, in particular, is truly the most base of all, because the hitherto described Hungarian, if in addition he calls himself a Christian, then to his original defects are added those of the most base and vulgar servility and arrogance. Because this is the height of everything, when the Christian Hungarian, let's say, blesses the soldier's flag before the bloody skirmish, or when the Christian Hungarian slinks away into some protected corner, if danger threatens so-called human dignity in his vicinity, or when the Christian Hungarian, this scoundrel in disguise, puts on the most benevolent of faces and goes to obtain his own share of power and privilege. Everything that takes place in a church, after all, this is a desecration, if I may express it that way. More precisely, this is true desecration, because no matter how he enters that church, and even the fact that he enters the church at all is the pinnacle of hypocrisy, and then he walks out of there as if nothing had happened. The essence of the relationship between priest and believer in the Hungarian Christian church is that of a band of mafiosi cutting their deals, no matter what is at hand. One legitimizes the other, and the other, after muttering some mumbo-jumbo in exchange, lets him loose on the world again. Well, this is how it is in Hungary. This is how it is in woeful Hunya. This is how it goes among these sneaky gangsters beneath the cross, and their faces don't burn in shame. Moreover, they form an integral part of society. Alright, so now that we have discussed the 4 books of the quartet, I think it would be in this section that we discuss the observations, the analyses, and everything else that we find with the books, and any interconnecting threads that might be worth exploring. So, first of all, from the get-go, we'd observe, again, it's been advertised as a quartet. And what exactly makes it a quartet? Well, if I were to observe, like on the surface level of all the books, what made them all part of this quartet? Well, of course, the main theme would be apocalypse, right? Apocalypse is the genre. I mean, you have the same theme reiterated over and over again throughout the 4 books, and of course, they all revolve around more or less the same locale, the same town, the unnamed town in Hungary, right? So in Sátántangó, you have that town towards the tail end of the communist reign in Hungary, sometime between the 80s and before 1990, perhaps. The same goes with the Melancholy of Resistance, around the same time period as well. I'd place it at around, again, late 80s to before 1990. War and War is post 1990, as evidenced by some dates given when Corin flew out to New York. It was like 1990 something, right? And Báró Wenckheim, again, it's set in contemporary times already, around 2010s, as evidenced by some contemporary references, like, for example, Eminem. I'm surprised Eminem even had a mention in the book, like, as pleasantly surprised. But that's beside the point. But again, to reiterate, all of these 4 books have this theme of apocalypse as a genre, right? You have apocalypse in more or less two categories, as I've observed, right? So you have apocalypse by way of the Messiah or false Messiah, false prophet narrative, right? And then you also have the kind of apocalypse in which there is this madness, right? There's darkness all throughout, but then there's this central light in the middle of all of these chaos, all of this madness, right? So to discuss the first kind of apocalypse, the first kind of narrative that erupts out of this apocalypse, right? The Messiah or false prophet narrative. So in Satantango and in Báró Wenckheim's Homecoming, there are two instances of misattributed messiahs, right? So in Sátántangó, it's of course Irimias, right? And he has this trusty Petrina beside him, his familiar, so to speak, or kind of manservant, right? And then in Báró Wenckheim's Homecoming, you have the eponymous Baron Wenckheim, and Dante acting as his kind of familiar and what have you, manservant, right? So there's this kind of repetition, right? There's this spiritual continuance from the first book to the last book, right? And by their presence in the narrative, like it serves to foreground some ominous implications, right? So in Irimias and Petrina's cases in Sátántangó, their arrival on the town, on the unnamed town, signals a kind of disintegration, right? You have the people celebrating for their return because they believed for some time that they've died or were presumed dead, right? Until they decided to come back to this unnamed town, right? But then their arrival signals a kind of disintegration in the sense that whatever mundane routine they had placed or that they've committed to for all this time, right, had been upended by their arrival. And so with their arrival came promises of rising up from their hard circumstances, right? Because Irimias came with promises of starting a commune or wanting to help the people alleviate their current circumstances, right? As brought on by the tail end of communism. Because around that time, Hungary was in a volatile state of political instability. There are many changes happening, so on and so forth, right? And Irimias and Petrina arriving at the scene is a kind of godsend for them, they feel. Kind of godsend in the sense that by the time that they have arrived, Irimias has promised that they would be transferred to Almasi Manor. Promised them jobs in this new commune, right? And by doing so, he'd be able to help alleviate their circumstances. But then what ended up happening was the proposed commune, right? He just had it as a plan B. In the meantime, like he had it on the back burner. Because what he planned to do, right? Because he found out through bureaucratic nonsense that his plans to realize the commune were not ideal in the current political circumstances, right? So what he did was he had those townsfolk that he rounded up, he assigned them different jobs, different roles. He told them to look for this or that contact, right? So that they'd set them up for when he'd have the commune at a later time, right? When everyone has already moved away to all these different places, right? So there's a kind of Jakob Frank situation, right? If you've read Olga Tokarczuk's books of Jakob, right? There are these times when Jakob Frank would gather his disciples and then would have them assume different identities and then would scatter all throughout Europe or all throughout the world, right? In an effort to escape harsh penalties, because right around that time Jacob Frank and his disciples were being harassed or being persecuted for their cultish activities, so to speak. So in a way, that kind of parallels Irimiash and the townsfolk's circumstances, in the sense that he, in order to realize a vision that's not yet ripe for the taking at that moment, he had the people assume different identities or assume different roles and had them spread out all throughout Hungary or whatever have you, so that one day when the promised time will come, right, they would go back and form this commune. But then, as we all know, or as the narrative implies, that really doesn't materialize, right? So again, there's this false sense of, like, Irimiash lulled them into this false sense of promise, so that he could perhaps take advantage of the fact that he already had his money from them when he made that speech, right? He had taken funds. Whatever those funds were going to be used for, we aren't really given the answer, but it's as if he had defrauded them and had ran off with the money. But then he makes a show of going back to the manner in which he'd sent for all of his newly converted disciples, right? These townsfolk who have no direction or purpose. He makes a show of having returned. I mean, when he said that I am only one man, you think I'd make it to this manner in just a few days? I'm just one man, I'm just walking, right? So there's this sense of, again, pulling back into security and all that. And in a way, this also ties into, again, but different. This ties into the Baron's circumstances, but different, right? Whereas Irimiash returned to the town in order to try to prove something or try to reclaim it. Like, there's a kind of manifest destiny happening, right, by his return. The opposite is true for the Baron, in the sense that the label of manifest destiny is essentially thrust onto him by the townsfolk or by the mayor, by everyone in the town who expects to be receiving him with their highest graces, right? When the Baron, in actual fact, had just run away from South America to escape his gambling debts, right? And by doing so, he effectively just went back to Europe, to this small town where he originally came from, in order to escape all of that, in order to forget all of that. But then what ended up happening was he was ascribed this kind of savior title, but then he is not their savior. He continually insists, but then is continually flustered by the fact that people have ascribed the savior title onto him, but then he doesn't see himself that way, because he can't be bothered to fix anything. It's just that the people, especially the mayor, kept on hyping up all these people. He kept on promising that, oh, this Baron, he will form these funds. He will put together some funds so that this town will be rehabilitated to its former glory, but that doesn't end up happening at all, right? And so what ends up happening is, again, there's a pattern going on here between Irimiash and the Baron. Irimiash, in the sense that he had willingly placed this false promise. He is the false prophet here. And the Baron, in the sense that the title of prophet has been thrust onto him, thereby making him an indirect false prophet by way of people's expectations of him, right? So in a way, this is a kind of, to use some biblical allusions, Gog and Magog, right? Now, if you look at Revelations or the book of Ezekiel, right, you'll know that Gog and Magog are these forces. It's unclear if they're a tribe or if they are cities or if they are rulers who want to bring on the end of the world, right? Like they will come together and overrun the world. But then God intervenes, and then an earthquake happens, and then they are buried in rubble, continually breaking through the rubble. And when they break out of that rubble, they will wreak havoc upon the world, right? So in a way, the parallels between Gog and Magog are kind of visible in the sense that Iremiash and Iremiash's pet slash Petrina, or the Baron slash Dante, or whoever, they kind of represent the symptoms of disintegration. Like their arrival hastens disintegration in a way that Iremiash, by his arrival, signaled a breaking point when these civilians, these villagers in this town, they've reached this kind of high, this insatiable high that everything will be fine, and that everything will be gone once Iremiash deals with everything. Or in the Baron's case, that people have also worked themselves up to this insatiable highs, or these massive expectations that aren't fulfilled at the end of the day, right? And so this is what I think of the parallels of symptoms of disintegration and all that, right? And then that's it for the first part, right? The false messiah slash false prophet narrative that came out of the apocalypse theme in these 4 books. Well, the second one I want to discuss is, again, the lights at the center of all madness, or darkness as I'd call it, right? And those themes are more evident in, again, Valuska from the Melancholy of Resistance and Corin from War and War. Now, both of these characters, they are obviously holy fool archetypes, right? Valuska in the sense that he is this kind of angelic slash foolish character, right? Who tries to make good on, or tries to see the positive, or tries not to let the world get to him, right? But then all of this madness comes crashing down. Not the same thing with Corin, but then different almost, because Corin, he had this goal, right? And he is determined to, like, the goal being to bring this manuscript out into the world, right? Then he is very determined to get to see through this goal. He doesn't let the world get to him. He tries to live up to this ideal posed by this manuscript, right? The ideal of history as a circular revelation, kind of. And both of these characters, they, apart from being the lights at the center of all madness or darkness, they, like, these lights at the center of all these instances of madness or darkness have some attached physical objects or physical markers to them, right? With Valuska, it's the dead whale's corpse, and with Corin, it's the manuscript, right? And in a way, both of these characters, to bring up another biblical allusion, right? So, whereas Iremiash and the Baron are kind of Gog and Magog, Valuska and Corin could be Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is, to recall the Bible again, Isaiah is one of the great prophets who formed lots of writings about Jesus Christ, right? He'd been responsible for most of the Old Testament writings on Jesus Christ, and so many people have credited him and his verses for detailing with immense accuracy, or all of that, like all these instances of Jesus Christ and all his life stories, right? And so Voluska and Corin, they are different kinds of prophets in the way that in the sense that they are trying to make something out of their circumstances, seeing the good in their circumstances, or trying to live up to ideals which are almost impossible to realize, right? And by doing so, they inevitably work themselves into a state of, again, a physical state of impossible expectations, right? And in a way, these four characters, or these four manifestations of, again, there's the false prophet and then the light's at the center of all darkness and madness. All of these four characters corroborate each other and often lead to, again, some effects which I will be detailing below. Specifically, the kind of revelations like outcomes that happen in the four books, right? Now, to quote Revelations 6, many verses in Revelation 6, because I couldn't help but see a kind of biblical theme running through the whole thing, right? The whole quartet. If we were to lay out Satantango, the Melancholy of Resistance, War and War, and Báró Wenckheim's Homecoming, if you were to lay them out before you, right, and have Revelation 6 as your reference, you could see how the four seals, right, the first four seals open up by the Lamb of God, would relate to the four horsemen of the apocalypse, kind of. Sátántangó would be the first seal, I think, which is the victory, the horse of victory, right? Victory in an ironic sense, though, like because Iramiash in his return heralds a kind of victory for the townsfolk, right? Because his return signaled the improvement of their circumstances, but then this victory is ironic in that nothing of Iramiash and nothing of his promises, not all his promises were fulfilled, right? He had to make do with a compromise. And then the Melancholy of Resistance, okay, so the thing is, you'll have to switch the order a bit for this second and third seal. So the second seal would be another horse, which is the red horse. No, red horse, rather, which is the second seal, is war, bloodshed, conflict. War and war, of course. That is a very apt comparison for the red horse, this book. In the sense that the manuscript that Corin has worked to upload to the internet, the manuscript of these brothers in arms escaping the vicissitudes of history, or the tides of history, constantly returns to these themes of war, bloodshed, and conflict, right? He keeps on returning to these themes while experiencing a kind of violence of a different kind as he's working on the manuscript. Is, again, it really ties into that seal, really ties into that second horseman, war, right? The Melancholy of Resistance would be the third seal, which is, again, okay, this is famine, economic scarcity, right? Because Voluska, when he catches word of the dead whale, and when other people in the town catch word of the dead whale, they immediately assume that famine or economic scarcity or the end of the world, the end times are upon them, right? And so in an effort to quell their fears about the end times, they try to hold on to some semblance of order that they have. Some turn to cosmology, as in, for example, the solar eclipse section right in the beginning, and then you also had fascism, but with Miss Esther plotting to take over the town in the confusion of the whole mess, right? And then you had people rioting in the streets towards the middle, or towards the middle to the end of the book, right? Because the prince character was acting out of order, and so he rounded up his so-called devotees, or his so-called zealots, right, in order to wreak havoc on the town, in order to influence the chaos, the madness, the futility of everything, right? And of course, Baron Wenckheim would have to be seal number 4, which represent the pale horse with widespread death and pestilence, again, because of what happened in the later parts of the book, right, in which all of these things were happening, like the burning oil, the burning field of that stank of oil, the oil tankers appearing out of nowhere, like the pestilence, in the sense that after the letter to the Hungarian section, right, all of these people started disappearing, all these people started dying, no one was willing to go out of their houses, and it all ended in flames, right? So that was it. So that was what I observed as the pattern, right, for these 4 books, that they are essentially a kind of 4 horsemen of the apocalypse kind of situation, right? Again, this is just this might be overreading, but it's a kind of coincidence that I just recently thought about, right? The coincidence of these 4 books being 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, maybe. Where if Krasznahorkai intended it to be that way on some subliminal level, I'm not sure, but that's how I interpreted it, at least. In a way, again, the return of these messianic figures have induced outcomes that mirror the Book of Revelations, right? Especially Baron Wenckheim. I have to emphasize the fact of Baron Wenckheim's homecoming being the most Revelations-like, again, in treatment. Well, Melancholy of Resistance could also count, but it's more pronounced, I think, in Baron Wenckheim. And this, like, for example, there's this scene with the oil tankers, right? That could be like on a book by book basis. If you were to compare the oil tanker scene to the Book of Revelations, it would be like the scorpion-tailed horse-like figures, right, wreaking havoc on the world. Because like around the same time the oil tankers arrived, people started dying off or started disappearing, right? And so many populations of that town were wiped out. Okay, and again, there's the fire and brimstone, which is also equated to the explosions that happened in the town, that wiped out the town. That's one reading of it. I'll leave some of it unexplored, but then you could pick up where I left off in your own readings. Those are what I think of when I notice these patterns, these instances of apocalypse that crop up between these 4 works, right? And to conclude, what Krasznahorkai set out throughout this entire quartet is the fact that apocalypse has always been a condition, a condition that has been brought about by our discontent, right? Apocalypse in terms of discontent, in the sense that in our everyday life, in our discontent, we lose ourselves in these mundane acts, these cases or these instances of internalized violence, internalized struggle, that we lose sight of what lies ahead, right? So that we've induced ourselves into a state of learned helplessness. As a result, apocalypse has become a symptom of, again, moral disintegration or slow social collapse because people are too distracted. People are too consumed in daily life to care about everything else, right? There's this primal feeling that we all carry within ourselves, that unknown, that we wouldn't dare imagine, because doing so might upset the balance of the cosmos, might upset the balance of what we hold near and dear, right? As to recall the Melancholy of Resistance, right, in which you had Esther, Georgie Esther, contemplating the imperfections of the Werckmeister harmonic scale, right? And that he believes that since Werckmeister had appropriated this scale of harmonies, he has in fact upset perfection itself. Like, it is like this musical scale is proof that we are essentially imperfect beings, right? And that by realizing that these imperfections exist, it's as if we're equating all of these imperfections to the fact that everything is a mistake. That by believing in the mistake of God, the mistake of all of these circumstances, apocalypse is only accelerating. And I guess that's what Krasznahorkai set out to do. I guess one of the things that he set out to do, to make us realize that this apocalypse before us is, again, an inevitable part of the human experience. Because time and again, civilizations have risen and fallen, and so we are, again, currently in the midst of a decline. As you might look at the news and think that, like, the world is going to shit, right? But then you still have this underlying sense of everything will be fine, everything will be alright in the end. But then we really can't tell. That's it, I guess. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much. I tend to ramble a lot in these long forms of mine, but then I try to balance it all out with a little humor and all that. So thank you so much for making all of this possible and for encouraging me to keep making these videos, right? And we are approaching 1 year, or by the time I upload this, I'm already looking at 1 year for Gravity's Random. So whoopee, Gravity's Random turning 1 year by the time I upload this video. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you when I see you. Bye bye.